Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Kobi Kastiel, Professor of Law at Tel Aviv University, to discuss his paper, The Rise of Private Equity Continuation Funds, which he co-authored with Yaron Nili, Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, Kobi, thanks a lot for speaking to me today.
Tom, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, I should say from the outset that this is a really rich paper with a lot of nuanced and detailed insights. And so we're only going to be able to scratch the surface today in this conversation. But I do think it's really essential reading for anyone involved in private equity investment. So I would encourage viewers and listeners to read the full paper. And I think we can assume that our viewers know the basics about how PE works, the role of GPs, that's general partners, and LPs, that's lead partners, as well as the kind of basic 2 and 20 remuneration model in PE. But they may be less familiar with continuation funds. So, Kobi, let's start with that. I mean, what is a continuation fund? When are they used, and how has their use grown in recent years?
Continuation funds, it's a recent innovation. They offer a creative solution to get around the 10-year time limitation of the traditional private equity model. So in the past, fund investment were expected to be liquidated, say, up to, say, within 10 years, either to an IPO or a sale to a third party. But now sponsor, they have an alternative. They can sell either a single asset or multiple assets to a new fund managed by exactly the same sponsor. And this is how this transaction works. Usually the sponsor will approach the limited partners and provide them with the option either to roll their interest into the continuation fund or to exit or to liquidate their investment. At the same time, the sponsor will also contact new investors. They will infuse money, they will infuse capital to the continuation funds, and this capital will be used to cash out the selling LP. Now, this phenomena is really booming in recent years. Just to give you an example, Tom, in 2021, this transaction reached their largest volume in history, and they were estimated at around $70 billion in deal value, and market participants estimate that they are here to stay, that this phenomena will continue to go. Now, interestingly, supporters of continuation funds often view them as a triple win, right? A win-win-win to all parties involved. For the legacy funds LPs, it's a win because they get the optionality, they get to choose. The new investors, they get exposure to more mature and visible assets. And the GP, the sponsors, they get to keep managing assets that they like for an expanded period of time. But, whenever someone tells me that something is a triple win, I tend to be very skeptical. And indeed, in the paper, we expose all sorts of potential conflicts that this type of transaction raises.
Yeah, and so what's interesting is, as you described there, the investors in the continuation fund could be the previous limited partners, but may not be the previous limited partners. But it certainly will be the sponsor, the general partner. And you lay out really some quite serious potential conflicts of interest that can arise between the general partner and different categories of LP. Can you just talk us through the key components of those conflicts?
Yes, sure. So, when we think about the traditional private equity models, so there the interest of the GP and the LPs are very much aligned because the GP gets 20% of the profit it generates to investors, right? That's the carry interest. Now, in continuation fund transactions, things tend to be more complex. The GP basically puts itself in a position where it is committed to two groups of investors whose interests are in a direct conflict, right? Think about the existing LPs. They are interested in selling their assets at the highest price possible. Yeah. The new LPs who come on board, they are interested in paying the lowest price possible. So the GP is a dual fiduciary standing on both sides of the deal. And the data we provide in the paper shows that these conflicts are pretty severe. Why? Because 80 to 90% of the LPs in the legacy funds, they tend to cash out. So those are a totally different group of investors. The other thing that we show in the paper is that the GP has really strong interest in initiating this type of continuation fund transactions, sometimes more than is socially optimal. Why? Because the GP will receive significant benefits from this type of transaction. they will get additional management fees of 2% for additional period of time. They have the option to receive additional carry when they conduct the real final exit when the continuation funds is selling its assets. They can double down on successful investment or successful assets by using the carry interest that they get from the sale to the continuation funds and reinvest it as an equity investment in the continuation funds. Sometimes the GP will initiate a continuation fund transaction relatively early in the process, right? Investors
that really surprised me. Yeah, say a bit more about that. I thought it would be a 10-year thing, but say a bit more about that.
Right. So this is really interesting. And investors also, they are very frustrated because sometimes they ask, what's the rush? Why we need to initiate continuation funds transactions so early? So even there, the GP may get some unique benefits, right? For instance, they get to crystallize the carry interest relatively early in the process, and the carry is no longer subject to a clawback requirement. They sometimes, when the sponsor understands that they are not going to make the carry in the original funds, they are not going to meet the requirements for receiving carry from the original funds, they can basically reset the carry terms by moving the successful assets to the continuation funds and increase the likelihood that they will get a return on that investment. Now, there is also another rationale behind it, which is sometimes there is a fast-growing asset and they need to move them to a separate vehicle. So the situation is a bit more complex, but the conflicts are there for sure.
Yeah, it does sound like it's a win-win-win, but maybe just for the general partner. But you highlight in the paper a number of mechanisms that are supposedly in place to protect LPs, and actually in a number of cases you show how they may not be that effective. I'd like to focus on just one of those, which is market discipline. And in the PE world, the idea is often put forward that, well, these lead partners are sophisticated investors. They're perfectly well equipped to bargain with general partners. So why don't we just let them get on with it? We shouldn't be too concerned. Caveat emptor applies. There are reputational penalties for GPs. But you find a different picture based on some very interesting interview research you did. Can you just explain briefly how you got hold of the data that you base your conclusions on? And then why is it that this sort of market discipline mechanism, in your view, doesn't really work?
Right. So, continuation funds, to some extent, they are a black box, right? Information on the original limited partnership agreement is not available to researchers. There is very limited data on the performance of these funds. So to overcome this type of informational limitation, we conducted interviews with market participants, so both investment officers on the LP side and legal counsels for GPs, to shed some lights on the questions on the realities of continuation funds transaction. So to your specific questions about what's going on here, why investors are so displeased. At the end of the day, they get the optionality, and this optionality provides them with the ability to fend for themselves. They can cash out if they want. They can roll over. But our interviews shows that the situation is much more complex, and investors, they basically feel a lot of times that they are being pushed to the wall, right, with their back to the wall. Why? Because when they get when they have to make this decision about the continuation funds transaction, usually they don't have a lot of time to do it. They have only 10 to 20 days to make an informed decision. For pension funds that have to take this decision to the investment committee, it's not realistic, right? They cannot do it in such a short period of time. Sometimes they don't have enough information. The GP obviously control the flow of the information in those situations. Those are private transaction, illiquid assets. There is not enough transparency here. Sometimes they don't have the expertise to do it, right? The whole reason they invest with KKR or Apollo in the first place is because they don't know how to perform the diligence on specific assets or how to value those assets. And now they have more and more of this type of deals being brought to their attention, and they simply don't have the skills and capacity to do it, especially, the small or mid-sized pension funds. Sometimes they might be motivated by some additional considerations that are going on in the background. They have liquidity preferences. They may not be overly allocated to private equity. Sometimes they cannot invest in specific assets for diversification consideration. There are also internal agency problems here. Right? Think about the compensation structure of investment professionals at pension funds. They sometimes would like to get liquidity and return on investment fast because of their compensation structure. They wanted bonus before Christmas, right? They don't want to wait 6-5 additional years until the continuation funds assets are liquidated. They don't even know if they will be there 6-7 years from now. So that's why, I mean, if you think about all of those issues together, that's why some of them feel that they are being forced to sell their stakes, even if the terms are not very favorable to them.
Yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it? So then you get this fact that 80 to 90% of them do sell, and that just exacerbates the conflict then, doesn't it? And so, I mean, the SEC's kind of clearly alert to this issue, and they've proposed a remedy, which is to have a mandatory fairness opinion. I mean, you're not that convinced that that's sufficient. Why not?
So when we spoke to market participants, both on the GP side and the LP side, both of them strongly criticized the SEC solution. On the GP side, they said, this is a costly solution. It really forces us to invite a fairness opinion before every transaction, even when we feel that it's not required. On the LP side, they were skeptical of a mandatory use of fairness opinions because of structural biases. Right? At the end of the day, the sponsor is in charge of selecting the financial advisors. The financial advisors are a few repeat players who have very strong incentive to provide an opinion that will please the sponsor because they want to be selected to give the next opinion to the sponsor. That's why the LPs think that they cannot really trust this fairness opinion.
Right. Yeah, interesting. I mean, so overall, my read of the paper was that while you recognise the benefits of continuation funds, you've concluded that there are really very significant problems about how they operate at present, and that does justify regulatory intervention. And is that right? And if so, can you pick out the one or two potential interventions that you think are most promising?
Right. So, towards the end of the paper, we put on the table a number of alternative solutions that we think can be adopted, by the way, either by market participants or by the regulators. And here also one is to take into account that it's a relatively new phenomenon, so it makes sense to see how the market reacts to it. But having said that, you're absolutely right that we are a bit skeptical of the ability of the market to self-correct because of various reasons that we detail in the paper. And also, when we wrote the paper, we felt that the train has already left the station, in a sense that the SEC, as you mentioned, was already regulating this space. And that's why we wanted to add just a couple of proposed solutions to the table that could be considered. So I will focus on one of them, which I think is the most important solution, which is basically to empower the legacy funds LPs. Right? This is something that we do all the times in the context of conflicted transactions in public companies. Right? We provide more power to unaffiliated shareholders. So we can do the same here. Basically bring the decision to initiate a continuation fund transaction to the LP base to mitigate misuse concerns. Right? Currently, the LPAC, it's like an investment committee of 3-4 large investors. This is the body that basically approve the continuation fund transactions. But there were concerns that were raised also in the interviews that the 3-4 members of the LPACs usually have a very strong relationships to the GP, and they tend to approve whatever the GP brings to their attention. So the idea was to bring it to a broader LP base. Those investors, the legacy fund LPs, they also can select the financial advisor to mitigate the structural bias we discussed earlier. The one who object the use of continuation funds could also be part of the LPAC and oversee this type of transaction and represent the interest of the selling shareholders because they are the one who are going to sell as well.
Yeah, I mean, this struck me as a very sensible kind of approach that goes with the grain. It doesn't try to disrupt the emergence of this sort of market approach, but it does introduce some safeguards. One thing that struck me from the paper is that continuation funds can be somewhat sprung upon LPs who may have entered into a PE investment some years in the past without really considering this as a possibility. And particularly for LPs like pension funds who perhaps aren't the most sophisticated or maybe don't have the greatest level of resources to scrutinize these proposals. How should the rise of continuation funds, in your view, affect their approach to PE investment?
It's a very interesting question. So pension funds are to some extent in a very complex situation, right? Because on the one hand, they want to invest in private equity. It's an important asset class. They want to diversify their investment. They think about the potential of high profits. On the other hand, it's a very risky investment due to the lack of transparency and due to the sophistication of the players involved in this area, mostly the GPs. And there is a whole large body of literature showing how the GPs sometimes take advantage of their sophistication to benefit themselves at the expense of pension funds. This is a general tension that exists with respect to private equity investment, but it also exists in the situation of continuation funds. Now, we don't suggest that pension funds will stop investing in PEs, but our study shows that small and mid-sized pension funds should be very careful when conducting this type of investments. In particular, we show that there is a significant heterogeneity when you think about the body of LPs, especially when it comes to sophistication and bargaining power of some of those funds. And this can impact the relationship with the GP, right? So think about large pension funds like CalPERS. They have the ability to retaliate when the GP is misbehaving. The story is totally different when we talk about small or mid-size pension funds that have limited interactions with the GP, that they have limited ability to retaliate if the GP is misbehaved because the GP cares less about the relationship with them and because there is a long line of other investors who are waiting for private equity allocations. Another important point that was raised in our interviews is that private equity investors generally avoid suing the GP, even in situations when the GP is misbehaving. Why? Because no market player wants to be the investor that has a bad reputation among GPs as the one who basically take them to court. So overall, we show that the effectiveness of non-legal sanctions and reputation markets are much weaker when it comes to small or mid-sized pension funds, and they are the ones who should be very careful when conducting this type of investments.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really came out of your paper, I think, is the strength, the power of the position that these large GPs are in, and it really was an eye-opener for me. It was, and thanks for a great discussion to bring out some of the highlights of what is an excellent paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. It was my pleasure.